Hey everyone, this is Luke Johnson and Robert Schut. We are back doing our ninth installment of Soren Kierkegaard's Philosophical Fragments, and we'll just jump right into it. Robert, why don't you take the lead, my friend?
Okay, well, we're going to pick it up from chapter 4, and chapter 4 has a number of parts to it. The part we're doing today is called the interlude, and I'll open up with the text that the interlude actually opens with. Is the past more necessary than the future? Or when the possible becomes actual, is it thereby made more necessary than it was? You really have to think about this quite a bit to kind of, I know it's hard when you're not reading it and you're listening to somebody read it, but what he's telling us here is we're going to talk about what does it mean to be necessary. Is it possible for history to be necessary? And we'll talk about what necessary means. But that's anyway, just to whet your appetite a little bit about what we'll be talking about. The interlude is an extremely difficult and dense portion. One commentator, Niels Tholstrup, says that it is one of the most difficult of all his writings. For me, it was the most difficult, at least up to this point in what we've done. So I hope that Luke and I can make it a little bit clearer for you. So Luke, if I kind of screw up and I don't clarify and I don't leave me hanging, just come in and interrupt and say I don't understand what you're trying to say. So we can keep it clear.
Yeah, I think maybe it would be important to say why you found this to be so difficult. I'm not saying that it's not, but I mean, we've tackled a lot of tough stuff here throughout all the seminars that we've built. What did you find so problematic about this?
I think his terminology. He's not the kind of philosopher who uses a word and then defines it immediately. He uses this idea like necessary. And he never tells you what it really means. You have to kind of extrapolate the meaning from everything you're reading. And it's not like you only have one word. It's like you're juggling. You've got all these other words, being and essence. And how does he mean this? And what's the context? So that it's like a circus going on, a circus of terminology going on. You don't know which ring to look at. It's like three rings, if you've ever been to the three-ring circus. It's just like, where do I look? What do I listen to here? And so you've got to read this stuff several times in order to make any sense out of it.
Well, thankfully, we're building a dictionary that will be featured on the Noetic app and website, so people can sort of consult that as they go through these materials and other texts as well.
Yeah, we're kind of taking the fun out of it, though, a little bit, but hopefully they'll appreciate it.
I think they will.
Also, there's an undercurrent that's going on here in this particular work, and in many of his works, the Hegelian undercurrent, where he's kind of giving Hegel's absolute method a couple of jabs now and again. So you've really got to be at least somewhat familiar with Hegel and his dialectical ideas as to be able to pick up on these little statements that he's making, which is kind of part of the fun of reading Kierkegaard here. He doesn't actually say it, but I think you can get the point if you're I'm not a Hegelian and I'm not that familiar with Hegel, but I'm familiar enough, I think, to pick up the jabs here when I see them. Now, when we think of an interlude or an intermission, the first thing that usually comes to mind is it's an opportunity to kick back a little bit and relax. I remember watching the movie The King of Kings. I don't know if you've ever saw that with Jeffrey Hunter about the life of Christ. It's one of my favorite. Oh, you haven't? Oh, it's one of my favorite movies.
Well, I imagine it would be like 8 hours long.
Oh, it was so long. And in the middle, they have an intermission. And it just says intermission on the screen for about 15 minutes. So you get up and you get your popcorn and your soda and you come back. And that's what an intermission or an interlude is supposed to be. But I guess this is part of Kierkegaard's sense of humor, the way he uses the term. This is by no means an interlude. This is a struggle. again, we want to pick up on that. And that's kind of the lightheartedness of Kierkegaard here, but you got to pick up on it.
Well, why do you think he names it the interlude? If it's not like this light, fluffy, philosophical milk dud, why does he even name it such? I mean, there's kind of like this whole play of sound going on, right? We saw at the end of the third chapter, the acoustical illusion or whatever.
Yeah.
It seems like he's kind of sort of painting the text as if it's some sort of orchestral thing. Do you have any theories on why he named this section the interlude?
Yeah, I think technically it's an interlude because it's an intermediate portion that goes between chapter 4 and chapter 5, where he talks about the contemporary. We spent most of our time speaking about the contemporary. And the next chapter that we're going to do is talking about the disciple at second hand, meaning the one who he's not the contemporary, the non-contemporary. So he's in the middle point here. So he's going to kind of try to take pieces of each one, fuse them together to prepare us for the next chapter. In that respect, it's perhaps an interlude. But one of the things that I've just recently realized about Kierkegaard is that it's not just what he says that's his statement. It's how he says it. He's so very unique because it's these little things that he does in his writings, the little stories he tells, and this little idea about the intermission or the interlude. It's all part of him trying to teach us what he was. That's what makes him such a unique philosopher. He's not the kind who just sits and says, okay, here's the thesis, here's the antithesis, and here's the synthesis, and that's it. And now I'm done. And now I'm just going to spend another 300 pages explaining that. He's just kind of plays with us as the audience, and he says, I'm going to teach you, and you're not even going to know you're being taught. So he's so brilliant, and I didn't really see that about him. Did you see that earlier about him, that his technique is actually part of his teaching?
Oh, of course, yeah. But I think you could write a lot. I mean, it's not like he has just one technique, though, right? But but it stood out to me very early on that this was a philosopher like none other. The usage of pseudonyms and the literary writing and all the rest. I mean, I think you could stand back and write something substantial about all the different teaching and philosophical techniques that Kierkegaard alone has in his toolbox that other philosophers don't make any use of.
So I think what we could bring to the table today is if our audience is going to read Kierkegaard, they can be head and shoulders ahead of everybody if they realize it's not going to be just what he writes, just the text, but to widen your horizon, just widen the scope a little bit and look a little beyond the text at the story he's telling and how he's telling the story. I think it becomes more evident in things like either or, where he actually uses characters. But in this particular text, he uses a whole different method to bring his ideas across, which I just was really impressed with. Yes,
definitely. So I think that's, and we should talk a little bit more, perhaps when we finish this, about the pseudonym Johann Climacus and what our sense of who he is after we've gone through all these chapters, and if perhaps we can even say how we relate to this pseudonym at some point. Like, or is Johann Climacus sort of a default position that perhaps you and I, as people that are interested in philosophy, fall back on, and we constantly need to get out of and back into that relationship of faith? I think for me, it's an easy default position.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in Climacus. It's easy to just forget it's somebody else, that this is a pseudonym. It's easy just to think this is Kierkegaard. As I even say it, most of the time I say Kierkegaard said this. I do have to remind myself it's Climacus. So yeah. It's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship of everything Climacus says is everything Kierkegaard believes, although I think we're pretty close, wouldn't you say?
I would say Climacus is one step away from what Kierkegaard really believed. I think Climacus sort of illustrates the person that has the philosophical comprehension of the thought doctrine that may be called Christianity. Yeah. But does he truly believe it in the most authentic and subjective sense? And I think the answer would probably be no. He is the person who's still trying to use philosophical discernment and apprehension to understand Christ, and he can't make that final existential involution, which we must do. Okay. And the thing is about Johann Climacus and this general sort of position that we as philosophers can take up, it's very seductive. It can sort of lull us into the somber where we don't think that we need to pray and we don't need to meet Christ in that Augenblick and in that moment, that we can sort of figure it out because we're so clever.
Right.
I know that's something that I personally struggle with. I do all this philosophy, and it's like philosophy, and then I say to myself, when was the last time I actually prayed? Right?
Yeah. We don't want to get lost in that. And philosophy is good as a tool to get us, but we have to keep remembering where our journey is and what we really want to get to. And for me, it's not to be a philosopher; it's to be the best Christian I can be. For me. Right. So this is a tool that I use. And Kierkegaard, I was just thinking about this today. Kierkegaard is the best, what would I say, the best method I have of expressing what I feel. It's not that I'm a Kierkegaardian or I'm just a little Kierkegaard going around. It's that I have my feelings and my understandings, and I want to communicate them, but I don't always have the method to do that. Right. And so I find that I can do that through Kierkegaard. So sometimes I get a little carried away with his words, but it's hard to tell where my ideas and his words kind of begin and end sometimes.
Well, it can kind of create a little bit of an identity crisis, right?
I do. Yeah. I admit to that.
Yeah.
But here. Okay, you would just say.
I would say, Kierkegaard did write a book, and we should maybe consider you and I know you and I have been having a lot of conversations off mic about what we'll do next and what proceeds logically next and what would be a nice respite from all this rigorous philosophy that we've been doing. He did write a book called, I believe it's called My Point of View as an Author, where he properly situates himself in regards to all these synonyms.
Yeah.
Have you read that one?
No. I've read about it, but I really do want to read it. There's a number of works that I haven't read, but that could be a great transition from here.
Yeah, I would submit it for your consideration, but yeah,
I will.
All right, we'll talk about that another time. So yeah, let's get going on this first section, or yeah.
So Kierkegaard starts us out, and he says, let's assume that 1,843 years have elapsed since the life of this teacher. Well, you don't have to be a mathematical genius to figure out what he's seeing is from the time of Christ till his time, 1843, things move forward here. So let's assume that we're in 1843. He is in 1843, but he's giving us a time frame here. And then he apologizes to us as the reader that he's going to do a lot of repeating of things, but he's doing this for the sake of the illusion, which we'll get into. I'll try to remove, in my particular portion, I'll try to remove as much of the repetition as possible. However, if I tamper too much with the text, I'm going to also tamper with the illusion. So I have to kind of tread carefully here. And this is why I was saying it's the repetition and all the things that he's including here that's part of the teaching. So if we try to reduce Kierkegaard down to just a couple of simple sentences, yes, we may capture what he's trying to say, but we're not going to get what he's trying to mean. We're not going to really grasp the fullness of his teaching, what we can grasp from it. He also, in this work, he takes a jab at Hegel when he says that you, as the reader, have probably ascended to the newest philosophy. Such philosophies are caught up in speculation and have lost all contact with reality. So he's addressing his reader in a somewhat pejorative manner here, and it kind of takes you aback a little bit. if you were the reader and he's kind of sending this message out to you, well, you probably, kind of the dilettante of philosophy, you're probably involved in the newest philosophies right now. But let me tell you that these philosophies of speculation have lost all contact with reality. I'm not sure people are just going to close the book up and say, how dare you insult me like this?
Right.
So I'm not sure, but he kind of includes that opening gesture there.
It's interesting to think about how there was a public that could, I think about our public today and how the different sort of spider webs that we can become ensnared in, right? Usually they involve corporate news or the newest dance craze or some viral meme or something like that. And apparently this has always been a trend in society, except it seems like at Kierkegaard's time, people were just getting caught up in German idealism rather than the mannequin challenge. And I don't know which is worse,
Yeah, it's an eye opener though, because he exposes that.
Right.
Again, this is just like one little simple subtlety that means so much to us in setting the background for what he's talking about here. Okay, so we enter section 1, coming into existence. Although he's not clear on exactly what he means here by coming into existence, I take it to mean a general one. And this is something that you and we haven't talked about this, Luke, but I'll bounce this off you a little bit here. An example of coming into existence would be a chair. Okay, a chair kind of comes into existence when it's created. It's a pile of wood, and then all of a sudden somebody puts it together, and now it's a chair. That's one way to look at coming into existence. We can alter the chair once it comes into existence. We can put pillows on it. We can paint it. We can put scroll work on it. We can do all sorts of things to it. So we kind of alter it, but we don't really change its existence as a chair. So we perform an alteration to it. And later he'll speak about things called necessity, or the necessary existence, and eternal existence. But for now, it might be easier if we take it to mean something in a very simple way. Now, this is where I'm going to need your help here, or at least your opinion. Coming into existence is a change from non-existing to existing. Now, when he talks like that, however, now he seems to go into a different area of ex nihilo, where you have nothing, absolute nothing, and then you have something, which is different than a chair. There's another kind of change that takes place within the framework of existence. So once something comes into existence, it has other changes like age, appearance, and even death, he reminds us of. It's not the same kind of change from coming into existence where there is nothing and then something. So let me stop here for a second and ask you, when he talks about coming into existence, how would you label that? Or how do you think of what he means there? Is it a general sense of coming into existence, or the specific ex nihilo coming into existence?
When I think about coming into existence, I think about things that are necessarily contingent. Things that can I shouldn't say necessarily contingent. I should say things that can engage in a process of becoming, right? Things that can undergo changes within time. So that chair once was a tree, and that tree underwent modification to become the chair. The chair can undergo modification to become firewood. The firewood can go under modification to be incinerated and put up into the atmosphere, and then so on and so on and so on. That's what I think he means by coming into existence. And why this is going to be so problematic is that I think what he means by necessary, and we'll take a look at this later, what I think he means by necessary is the necessary is inextricably linked to the concept of eternal, and the concept of eternal is something that is always continuous, and there can't be some sort of discontinuity where it changes into something else. And this is why the paradox is going to be so maddeningly problematic, because we've got the eternal entering into contingent being and becoming something else, becoming flesh, and not only becoming flesh, but then expiring, dying, entering into another state there, and then resurrecting, entering into another. We see God come into time and undergo all these alterations and changes, and that's why I think that's why the idea of a God man is exceptionally problematic, and where these terms of necessary and coming into existence and contingency all come into play. Does that answer the question at all? I mean, I think the only thing that I can think of is creation ex nihilo or however you pronounce that in terms of Latin. I think about that in terms of the creation of the universe. That there was something, or there was nothing, and that there was something, that there was just a void, and then there was a big bang. But I think you really have to, and I think it's a really deep philosophical question about whether or not there really, really, really was nothing. If our universe had to be proffered with some sort of material to then sort of spring into existence. And this gets into some really deep metaphysical stuff that people like Aristotle and other people take up. But it only may appear like creation ex nihilo to us, just like how people thought, I don't know, what was it, like spontaneous generation that you saw in the 19th century. They put water in a barrel, and then they'd see like paramecium and stuff like that moving around in it, and they must think, oh, it just came into existence. Well, no, there was actually something there. It's just we didn't have the science to understand what those fundamental elements were. So I'm not really sure what we really mean by creation ex nihilo, and if that's possible and all of that. All I seem to know is that the necessary cannot change, and that's ultimately at odds with anything that enters into the temporal framework. Does that help at all?
No, it does. It helps for now. We're going to get into it much deeper in Kierkegaard, and we're going to have to explain it a little bit more. For now, what I picture him trying to explain it as is closer to Socrates and Plato and the idea of forms. In forms as being something like the chairness and stuff like that coming into existence. So that's why I'm kind of having a little difficulty with it. Is he trying to keep it at that Socratic level, or is he giving us a more advanced idea? But for now, we'll take it. What you said, I think, is great. That's pretty good.
Yeah. I don't know. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's a whole different sort of narrative for how things are made, right? Because you've got like a demiurge that consults a form and then marries it with matter and all this other stuff. So I was thinking more along the lines of the Christian narrative, but that Platonic one presents its own set of problems too.
Yeah, so we're not quite sure at this point where he's taking us, but we'll just go where he's taking us. I don't want to put words in his mouth. That's one of the things I don't want to do. So he uses a Greek phrase that means a transition here. He uses the word genos, which is a sphere or a kind. So if you run into that word, he's talking about a change of sphere or a change of kind. If something exists as a plan or an idea and then comes into existence, does the plan actually change between genos? Does it change between spheres or kinds? If it does, what is the change? Is the idea and actuality separate, or is the idea a transformation into actuality? Is there something of the essence that remains? So for the sake of simplicity, let's think about a chair. You have an idea of a chair. You're thinking, okay, I'm going to build a chair. So you go out, you get a pile of wood, you put it together, and now you brought that chair into actual existence. Is there something that made the transition from idea to the chair? Is there some kind of essence that came from the plan into the actual product? Is what he's actually asking us here. Is that how you see that question, Luke? Which is a difficult question to start off with. He's not going to answer it yet. So we may not have an answer at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd have to know what are, how he's using essence here and what are the fundamental materials involved. Are we still talking about chairs, or are we talking about something else?
Yeah, this is why you asked me initially what made it so difficult. These ideas are all spinning in my head at the time. Where are we going with this? Are we going down this Platonic road here, or are we going down another road, like you said, the Christian road, or what? When change,
because I would just say this, like, if we're talking about the Christ, right?
Yeah.
If Christ becomes flesh and blood, I would say as he makes that transition from one realm or one sphere to another, there's essence that is retained, right? Even though there is perhaps an exterior that is contingent, right? That the word became flesh, but the word is still the word, whether or not it was on this side of eternity or not, right? Yeah. Whereas I'm not necessarily sure that essence persists from wood to chair.
Right, and that's what he's exactly. I think what he wants to try to develop that idea to eventually make his point. He says when change takes place between not existing or non-existing and existing, it's not a change in essence, but being. So here he gives us a little bit of the best definition he's probably going to give us, is that he's splitting essence and being and saying when we're talking about essence, we're talking about more the thing in our mind. What do we perceive when we see a chair? What's in our mind? That's the essence of a chair. What makes a chair a chair? In Greek terminology, and I've studied this in the Greek, this was always confusing to me to see what the Greek language has to say about it. And it's just as confusing in the Greek. So
okay.
I don't want anybody to think you're missing out because you don't know the Greek. But the idea here is that the essence is when you see something and you recognize it, that's kind of, we're dealing with the essence. You see something and you can touch it, you're dealing with the being. That's a very loose idea of it. So the being of a chair is I'm able to sit in it, I'm able to touch it, I'm able to rock in it or whatever. We're dealing with the being. So going from non-being to being is a change in that. Now we can't touch it, now we can touch it. Kind of, again.
So a chair's essence, if we had no chair, but we had the idea of chair, and then it became a chair, the essence on these definitions would stay the same, whereas the being would alter.
Yes. That's what I'm getting from what he's telling us so far. Okay. I'm not trying to add my own ideas so much into this. This is just my own understanding of what he's giving us.
All right, keep going. Yeah.
Okay. Remember that essence is the quality of the character of something, that is what we identify as the thing. While being is the outward appearance. One is the inward unchangeable identity, while the other is the outward changeable identity. So in our mind, the chair is unchangeable. I mean, a chair is a chair. But in reality, in actuality, we can make different kinds of chairs. We can paint them. We can put pillows on them. We can put rockers on them. We can make them high. We can make them short. Those are all not essence. That's all being, those transformations. So, and this is important to try to set up when we begin this project here, is to try to establish those words and what he means by those words. Otherwise, we'll be totally lost.
Yeah, I can see how we could easily get lost. Yeah.
In the case of the chair, we might say that the essence or the idea of the chair is what makes us identify it as a chair and not a house, while being is the actual wooden substance shaped into a chair. Talk about a change of essence, it would be a change of a chair into a house, two totally different things, even though they may be made of the same materials. They turn into two totally different things. So we're going to use that idea to kind of put in the essence definition, as opposed to the actual, or the what does he call it again? The substance as the being. That's what it was. The being as a chair.
So would that mean that some changes can change the being of a thing, but not its essence, and then other changes could change the essence and the being? For instance, when I go and make a chair, the essence from not on the side of non-being and being is constant, but its being is the thing that undergoes transformation. Now, if I were to go and deconstruct the chair and use it to build a house, has the essence and the being of the thing changed simultaneously?
It's like the Wittgenstein's old woman, young woman, and the
Duck rabbit.
The duck rabbit. It's one or the other. There's no transformation, according to this Kierkegaard. When we talk about essence, there's not really a transformation in essence. There is transformation when it comes to being. But it's either one idea of a chair or an idea of a house, is what I'm getting from it.
Okay.
But you can't mentally say, okay, mentally, there's something in common between a chair and a house as far as essence is concerned. The answer is no.
Okay.
Up to this point. That's what I'm grasping anyway.
Okay.
Okay. So if something were already existing and changed into change in some manner, it would be a change of existence. If we added a pillow to the chair, I'm kind of regurgitating what I already said, but the idea is, yes, you can make changes out of existence, but not essence. The change of coming into existence is absolutely different from any other kind of change. Matter of fact, the word change here may not even be suitable. So to think of something as coming from the idea into the actual is unlike any other kind of change. So when you have the actual and you're making changes to it, it's not at all the same kind of change that happens when something comes from non-being into being. So he's making that distinction, and that's an important distinction to make as we follow through his logic here.
How would you describe the change from non-being to being versus a permutation of something that's already being, is already existent? So going from no chair to chair is one type of change, right?
Yes.
Where we're going from being to non-being to being, but then if you add a pillow to that chair, you're enhancing the existence of things. So are these types of changes given different names?
I don't know if he gives them a different name. One is more of a transformation rather than, it's a change or a transformation as opposed to coming into existence is what this distinction that he's trying to make. Let's see how we can clarify it here. Let me read the next sentence here. Let's see if this helps a little bit.
Sure.
He speaks of non-being as a kind of possibility. Once it becomes actual, it's no longer a possibility, but an actuality. The difference being, I think answering your question is that when you have a change or transformation of the actual, there's something that's being transformed that it carries with it from change to change.
Yes.
But the change from non-being to being, there's nothing that the actual carries with it, nor can it, from non-existence to existence. There's no element of non-existence that it brings with it. Because
there was no antecedent state.
Yes, right. And there's no material. It's not like we're altering it. It's we're bringing it into actuality. That's not an alteration, in other words. Whereas what we're doing to the chair by enhancing it is an alteration. So he's just making that distinction between something very unique about non-being to being that we just can't seem to wrap our minds around at this point is what he's bringing. He's bringing up the question without actually answering it yet. So he just wants us to be aware of that difficulty, right?
Right. So I guess what I'm saying here is the thing that sticks with the alteration of actuality is that there was an antecedent state, whereas there wasn't one with non-being and being, where you had something come out of non-existence and into existence. I mean, they both retain both types of changes retain essence, do they not?
I would agree with you. I would say the essence isn't changed, though. The essence doesn't change because you put a pillow on the chair. You haven't changed the essence of a chair. You've changed the exterior. You've changed the identity of the chair, so to speak. Maybe you made it bigger, smaller, prettier, softer, harder, but it's still a chair.
Right.
Again, this is why I think about forms. It kind of fits what he's saying here. Whatever makes a chair a chair. Now, another question he asks us here: Can the necessary come into existence? What is necessary? Something that must exist. You covered this earlier, and that very well. So the question is: Can something that's necessary come into existence? That would assume there was a time when it didn't exist, and then it must not be necessary. So logically, the necessary cannot come into existence, or it would have been here by now.
Right.
Okay. The conflict here is that if something were necessary, it would always have to exist, and there could not be a time when it did not exist. So it would be a contradiction to say that the necessary came into existence.
Right. This goes back to when we talked about the proofs for the existence of God, and one of the problems that he had with that is that God was coming into existence in the conclusion, which cannot be done. Right. It kind of enhances the absurdity of trying to prove God in Kierkegaard's view, because we're like making God appear like pulling a rabbit out of the hat.
Right. Yeah. Right. A big rabbit. The necessary always relates itself to itself. And by this, he means that we see change when we make a comparison to what exists from one moment to the next. I kind of thought about it in terms like a mirror. Every morning you wake up, you look at yourself in the mirror. And, one morning you may get up and say, boy, I'm losing my hair, or my beard is getting too long, or I got a pimple on the tip of my nose. You see changes because
you're going savage on me, Bob.
Oh, no. No, this is nothing personal. You know that. I would never do that. But these are things that we see. We see ourselves get older. We see gray in the beard. There we go. We see gray in the beard that wasn't there before. Okay, all these things are taking place when we see ourselves in the mirror, David. And this is what he means when he talks about relating itself to itself. That's the impression that I get. The possible reveals itself as nothing in the moment because possibility disappears when it comes into existence. It comes into the moment. It's no longer possible. It's actual. And this, I hope this isn't too difficult here, but if something is possible, it can only be either possible or actual. Because if it's possible, it's not actual. Once it becomes actual, it doesn't exist anymore in the realm of possibility because now it exists.
Right.
So again, it goes a change of state as opposed to a transition. That's a good way to look. I never thought about that, but it's a change of state rather than a transition of state. Anything that comes into existence cannot be necessary because that would say that there was a time when it was not. If something were necessary, it means that it must always exist. In other words, for something to exist by necessity means it cannot be optional. Okay, and this is why we talked about, remember we were actually talking about the, what was it again? The heresy of Jesus having been an angel or having had a pre-existence, but there was a time when he was not. Remember that? And that would mean he can't be necessary and he cannot be God. He cannot be divine because divine is necessary. And if there was a time when he didn't exist, then he can't be necessary.
Right. This would go, I think we've talked about this in relation to two heresies, right? Or the Arian and the adoptionism view.
Yeah. So that would eliminate his divinity. And Kierkegaard is, I don't know, he's probably aware of those heresies, but he's focusing on something else here. But he just happens to capture that. A synthesis between possibility and actuality is impossible because they don't differ in essence, but in being. The thing had the same essence that it had while it was in the possible.
Right.
How can a synthesis take place is his question. They're not different in what we understand them to be, but in how they reveal it. The idea as a possibility is the same idea of what exists. The difference is in actually being what it is. Possible chairness versus actual chairness are the same, but they're the same in the sense that the actual carries with it the possibility. It's just subsumed. The possibility is subsumed in the actual. But he talks about synthesis here. So now every time he uses the word synthesis, my ears kind of perk up because this is probably Hegelian here, right? He's probably saying something about Hegel. So I thought that I would take a minute here to try to go over a little bit what I know and what I've researched about Hegel to give us an idea here.
That would be awesome.
Before I do that, it says here in my notes here, if they could come together, if you could synthesize possibility and actuality together, if they could come together in such a synthesis, it would change the essence. Since the essence is unchangeable, it cannot synthesize and remain the same essence. This is a contradiction and a discredit of Hegel's synthesis of history.
Well, what do you think that would look like for possibility and actuality to come together? Can we even comprehend it?
I think it would be in the area of a square and a circle.
Okay.
Putting the square and a circle together. Can you really synthesize a square and a circle and come up with, what would you come up with? You would destroy both of them because the square would no longer be square and the circle would no longer be circular. But would you have something new? That's probably not a good example. But my answer is no, I can't think of anything. When you take an essence of something, you're not going to wind up with a third essence. But let me go ahead and I'll let you think about that while I go ahead and discuss synthesis here just a bit. And I'm a little bit out of my league here with this, so you correct me if I say something wrong. I'm just going to parrot some things that I've read about it. This idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis actually isn't Hegelian exactly, but actually is developed by Johann Fichte. Is that how you say his name?
His name is Fichte, and you know, the idea of there being these, you know, Kant would talk about how there could be antinomies of pure reason. Well, you've got this on one hand, you got this on the other hand, and then he sort of gets deadlocked. So there's a historical indebtedness to Kant on these matters too.
Oh, okay. But he's given credit, at least the Hegelians claim that it wasn't really Hegel who did this, or other philosophers claim it was this guy, what was his name again? Fichte?
Well, I'm looking at your notes and you've got it spelled, I don't know if it was just unintentional dyslexia. You've got it spelled Fitch, which makes me think that it could possibly be someone else. Let me look that up real quick. But Fichte is someone that was in the same scene, but maybe it was this Fitch character. Let me look it up. Go ahead and
you go ahead and double check me because that's always possible. So we're going to deal with thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So in logic, we have a proposition. We make a statement. That's called the thesis. Then we have a negation of that statement, which is the antithesis. And together they form a synthesis, which is a reconciling of the above ideas to create a new proposition. Now, I have a section here. I don't like to do this. I rarely read because I know it's terrible for the listener to read.
I don't know if it is. I will say this. It is Fichte, and Fichte, you're correct. I'm just looking quickly here at Wikipedia. Fichte is credited with developing the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but he did it in response to the writings of Immanuel Kant. So I think we're both both right on this stuff.
Oh, okay. And I misspelt it then. It's Fichte.
It's Johann Gottlieb Fichte, Fichte, and he lived from 1762 to 1814. So he obviously would have had very familiar with Kant and very influential on Hegel and Kierkegaard.
Yeah, okay, good. That gives us a perspective. So this is something I'm going to read from the book Kierkegaard from Patrick Garnier, I guess it would be in French. Admittingly, this is page 48. It says, admittingly, and this is in regards to the book Either Or as well. Admittingly, and as the title itself implies, the book was partly conceived as a protest against the Hegelian notion that distinct forms of consciousness follow one another in a dialectically necessary sequence, mutually opposed standpoints being successively reconciled at higher stages in the progressive unfolding of the universal mind or spirit. In Kierkegaard's eyes, the transition from one mode of existence to another conformed to a wholly different pattern. It could only be achieved through an unconstrained and irreducibly personal choice between alternatives. Moreover, the alternatives themselves must be seen as being finally incompatible and not such that they could be ultimately harmonized and mediated in the light of some overarching theoretical insight. So his book, Either Or, is written specifically for this, to say not everything in real life has a synthesis. Some things you've just got to make a choice. It's going to be one or the other. It's either life or death. There's like not much in between there. You're either living or you're dead. But this is what Kierkegaard is saying is, sure, when you're speculating and philosophizing, you can come up with all these wonderful theories about life. But what about the real world? Does this synthesis really take place in the real world? And that's what his whole argument is about here. Did you find that section was appropriate?
Oh yeah, I mean, God, I think this whole seminar that we're having today is making me appreciate just how careful a metaphysician Kierkegaard really was. I usually don't think about him like that. I'm doing a lot of rethinking live on the air. I'm definitely taking in the three rings of the circus.
Yeah, okay. You're in one of the rings right now, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So then now he says that the necessary is in a category all by itself. Nothing can come into existence as necessary.
Now this seems as clear as day to me.
Okay.
This is the part that's not complicated for me. I'm still sort of struggling with how possibility is sublimated in actuality and whether or not this does or does not correspond with the Fichtean or Hegelian antithesis, thesis, synthesis sort of monstrosity. Yeah. But it couldn't be more obvious to me that the necessary can't come into existence. That is clear to me. Or does this become murky for you now?
No. This is like the respite. This is like the intermission. Oh, okay. I can breathe now again. Okay, I do understand this. I grasp this. He says the actual is no more necessary than the possible because necessity is different from both the actual and the possible. So necessity is something that's not the actual and it's not the possible. It's something beyond that.
Totally.
Okay, so he criticized Aristotle in that he assumed that everything necessary was possible. What was necessary could never have been in a state of possible, for that implies that it's not actual. Okay? So if it's necessary, it must be. This is the paradox. Or this is the Wittgenstein rabbit. What was that? Duck rabbit. Yeah. How do we make this connection? The necessary, if it's possible, means it's not in existence. If it's in existence, that means it's not possible. So how do we synthesize the possible and the actual for the sake of the necessity. How does something become necessary?
Do you expect me to answer that?
Well, I was hoping you were going to answer it, but
I think it just. I don't think things can become necessary, right? I think we have to abandon that question altogether. They just are necessary, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the word that it is when the actual solution doesn't offer you any more than the statement. I can't think. I'll probably think of the word later on. Yeah, it's actually not a valid statement to make. It's not a valid question because it contains in it a negation of the question. You know?
Right. How does the necessary become necessary?
Right. You've already answered the question.
Well, I think we get into questions about God being a being a prime mover, right?
Right.
That's what we're talking about here, is God being self-caused or something like that.
Right. So he uses the term freedom. Now he's going to throw another term into the mix, freedom, which he doesn't give it a definition anywhere. And so you've got to struggle with this to say, what is he talking about with freedom? I think that it means something opposed to necessity, something that didn't have to exist. It's free. It's free from being necessary. In other words, it can change. It's a kind of strange way to look at it, perhaps, but this is the best I could make of what he's calling freedom. In other words, you have the necessity or the necessary, and then you have something that's free. It's free to change and alter and do whatever it needs to do.
But I will say that this conception of freedom has got to be superficial to whatever. I mean, I guess Kierkegaard will use the word freedom in a multiplicity of ways. I mean, it would, if God is necessary, I don't think we want to say that God is unfree, right? Because I mean, presumably God would be in possession of the greatest amount of freedom you can have. It would mean that something contingent had a perfection greater than the divine, right?
Well,
wouldn't it? I guess what I'm trying to say, they're all different types. They're types of freedoms kind of swimming around here, because a freedom from being necessary might not be what we would call a positive freedom. That might be some sort of deprivation. That actually might be a negative type of freedom.
Yeah, I think he's putting boundaries on this word here for this particular sake of making his point. I agree with you. I think if we tried to say, okay, if that's the definition of freedom, we're in trouble. But right. I think this is kind of a passing idea that he's giving us of freedom, and maybe there's a better maybe somebody can come up with a better definition of freedom, of how he's using it in this. This is the best I could do.
That's fine.
But we'll see. Maybe if somebody does, they can certainly make a comment and call me out on that. And that's, I would, love to know another idea here. So nothing comes into existence by a logical reason, which is kind of maybe an anti-Hegelian comment here. Because new things come into existence all the time in the Hegelian idea through synthesis, unless I'm misunderstanding it. So this is kind of like through a portion of reasoning, through speculation, we can bring things into existence in a reasonable, rational way. But Kierkegaard has no part of that. And he says, no. He says, nothing comes into existence by a logical reason. It comes into existence because there's a cause to it coming into reason. Every cause terminates in a freely affecting cause, which he calls God. What does this mean? Is part of my notes. Okay, so the brakes come to a screen. We had our moment. We took a deep breath. Okay, now we're back in the mix here. So every cause terminates in a freely affecting cause. That's why I got the idea a freely affecting cause was something that could change. It had the power to change from one thing to another. But here he calls it God. And I'm thinking perhaps he's saying that everything has a cause, and that this cause has a cause, and we kind of take this argument all the way back, and these causes are not necessary, for they're free. So each cause is a free cause because it's not a necessary cause. Nothing brings itself into existence but requires a cause. So we have to take cause all the way back to the beginning, and he may be alluding to the proof of God being the first mover, or the first cause, or the prime mover. Remember that argument of, let's see.
Anselm, right? Or was that Aquinas?
No. Yeah, Augustine.
Augustine.
I believe it was Augustine, the prime mover. I think it is.
Well, it's got a long history. It depends on who you want to give credit.
Anselm is the ontological. He's the ontological argument. But I'm not sure. I'll leave that with a question mark then.
I can look it up. But I think the interesting thing here, right, according to what we've talked about here so far, is if things aren't brought into existence by logic, and they're brought into existence by a freely affecting cause known as God, does that mean that there doesn't necessarily have to be logical constraint with what God brings into existence? Is what Kierkegaard's saying here is that just whatever God decrees, and be it logical or not, is what brings something into existence? Is that how you understand what he's saying?
Yeah. And this is why it becomes difficult. The term freedom becomes difficult, because he's claiming here that all causes are freely affecting causes, because all of them can change. God doesn't change. So we can't really say so much. I think the terms free and causation probably we can't put in God. I think he's above that. I don't think he would fit into that box of being a cause. And this is, we talk about God, we talk about his word being the cause, right? Mm-hmm. So we talk in the Gospel of John, Jesus, the word becomes the word. He is the causation of all things. He is that free causation. God speaking things, perhaps not God himself, but God's words. The best way that they can describe it is not so much that God is the first cause, but his words are the first cause.
Right.
So we can at least take it back to his word, theologically anyway.
By the way, I just looked up here this prime mover argument, and the reason why that we had some confusion about who's responsible for it is that it keeps getting rearticulated through each epoch. It's typically traced back to Aristotle, but then it was further developed in Neoplatonism and early Christianity. We mentioned Augustine and Aquinas, and it even gets developed in Islamic theology, and it has contemporary defenders such as William Lane Craig and Robert Koons and Alexander Pruss and William L. Rowe. So, you said Augustine, that was correct. I said Aquinas and Aristotle, those were also correct.
Okay, it's good to be right once in a while. Listen,
yeah, you're right 99% of the time.
I'm willing to share it with you. Okay. Now we go move on to section 2. After we thoroughly understood section 1, we'll now go to section 2, the historical or the natural or nature. Everything that has come into existence becomes historical. Again, we could take a breath of fresh air there, right?
Right, sure.
Everything that's in existence is historical, even if it's only for a second. It begins its historical ascent or descent. Of course, the historical implies the past. The present presses upon the future, but is not yet historical. So the future has something in common with the historical, because eventually the future is going to become historical.
Right. So
it's almost like what we can say about the future. We can the historical. We can also kind of say about the future to a point. Now he's going to talk about the eternal under my subheading here, eternal. When we look at the eternal, it has no history. It's perfect. It has no beginning or end. In a sense, it's subsumed into eternity. It's history. So it's kind of sitting there as the eternal in both extremes of future and history. It reaches in both directions all the way, kind of like the parallel or the asymptotic thing where it keeps getting closer and closer, but never quite reaches there for eternity. It's that same kind of an issue here.
I want to ask a question about how this conception, and you'll develop it a little bit more. I'd like to see how it fits with your understanding of theology. I think a lot of people talk about eternity in a way that to humans, we only can endure what's immediate and present. And that seems like everything to us, but obviously you're talking about there's this projection into the future and projection into the past. And a lot of people have described what it's like for God is that God experiences everything at once. Is that all that eternity means? That like all of human time and all of the universe's time just appears in one moment to God? Or because in a way, I think that's a really fascinating thing to try to comprehend, but it is not without problems. How do you understand what eternity is? Because it kind of makes it seem like God is the totality of all events, but I don't know. I sense that there is something contradictory about that, and I tend to think that a better conception of what eternal is that God is somehow outside of time altogether, not that he's just all the constitutive elements of time appearing to his mind or his consciousness. Do you care to elaborate on that, and what's theologically sound and what's heretical? I mean, you have an understanding of these things that other people don't.
Well, I'm trying to find a scripture here that not sure that it helps a whole lot. I don't think I can find
scripture.
Yeah.
What does your gut tell you? What does your gut tell you about what eternity is for God? God's quality of being eternal.
Well, I know that what you said, I think, goes way back again to some of the church fathers like Augustine and others who tried to grasp the idea of the eternal when they tried to argue the point. I get lost in the eternal. I think that it says, I was going to look up, it's in Ecclesiastes, it says God has put the idea of eternity into the mind of man. And I think it's an idea in order, again, it's a boundary point. Like Kierkegaard talks about, it's a boundary point. In other words, I can't really conceive of it. I can conceive that there is something like that. There is an eternity, but I can't conceive of what it is. And I think it's that way for a reason, just like a lot of other paradoxes that Kierkegaard works with. It's not so much solving what eternity is, it's just recognizing that there is an eternity. In other words, God puts it in our mind in order to keep us humble.
So that passage from scripture that you're citing there is that God may give us enough of a glimpse of what eternity must be like, but just enough so we recognize that our rational capacity, our organ for discernment can't fully cognize it. Is that how you understand that scripture from Ecclesiastes? That like what our conception of eternity is a pale facsimile of what it really is, and it kind of puts a cap on it and humbles us. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I did find it. Let me read this to you. It says in Ecclesiastes 3, chapter 3, verse 11, says, he hath made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he hath set eternity in their heart. Yet, so that man cannot find out the work that God hath done from the beginning even to the end.
Right. So if presumably, if we could, right, then we could start to, I don't know, right, we could start to do things like
criticize God.
Well, yeah, we could do that, but we could also, I don't know, play the stock market to our advantage, or
Yeah.
or convict people for crimes that they haven't even committed because they may do it in the future or something like that.
That's an interesting one. Yeah. Yeah. So I deal with it the way that quotation is. It's something in my heart that just makes me love God even more.
Okay.
It's not something that I want to solve. I don't need to know it. I'm just happy that there is an eternity. So
I'm a moth to a flame on the concept of eternity. It's something that I just kind of keep going back to. And I don't think I'm the only one. I mean, I think there's an obsession with time travel movies and multiple parallel line stories. I mean, I think it's something that deeply fascinates humanity. There's quite the appetite for it.
I think it's a mirror of the heart. I think as you look into it, we can see more about ourselves than eternity itself. So it's one of those things that God gives to us to reflect upon, to teach us about who we are. Because, God isn't here to give us a lesson, a history lesson or whatever kind of science lesson and say, I'm going to teach you guys what eternity is. He's more the kind of person who's going to say, I'm going to show you eternity because I want you to be in awe of what's out there.
Right.
We see it and we say, oh, there's a puzzle to solve. But he says, no, I want you to learn about who you are in this vast universe. So it's a question of purpose. So, okay, let's see where we were. When we look at the eternal, it has no history. It's perfect. I said that. Okay. Can something that exists come into existence again? You ever think about that? Something already exists. Can it re-exist? Not really. This doesn't make any sense, right? It came into existence one time. It's done. It can change. It can alter. It can transform. But it can't re-enter into existence for what it is.
Well, right. I mean, and that's going to that's going to complicate things, right?
Well, he's going to build a point around that. He's kind of mentioning it almost as a thesis here. This is just kind of believe it for now.
Okay.
I think that he's speaking here about the possibility of nature coming into existence. Even though it already exists, can it come into existence in a historical sense? But he never answers the question. So at least so far, he hasn't answered the question. Can nature come into existence more than once? It's already come into existence as nature. Can it enter in a second time? Not really. Not in my mind anyway. Not in my logical system. I can't fathom it. Section 3, the past. What happens can't be undone. So that's a kind of another breather moment, right? We can say, okay, that makes sense. It's already happened. We can't undo the Vietnam War. We can't undo the election. It's done, right? So that makes sense.
I don't know. Those electoral college votes still have to be cast.
But we're still creating history. But no, the idea here is that once it's historical, it's an element. I mean, we may make a conclusion about the election, but the voting and all that is a done deal. They may massage it around a little bit or throw it all the way out, but it's still a done
deal. Nothing bad could happen from that.
So the immutability or the unchangeability of the past came about when the past came into existence. Can history change? Well, no. Not the way we understand it anyway. If the past is necessary in the eternal sense, we have to forget that it came into existence because it must have already been there. Okay, this is going to take a little explanation. So if we're going to make a claim that history is necessary, we have to prove that history never came into existence. Because if it came into existence, it can't be necessary. So that's what he's trying to prove here. This is what's behind the statement. So can we prove that history never came into existence? No, because by definition, we're saying history is what comes into existence. If it's possible you know, we could write a history book of all the things that are possible, but it wouldn't be a very good history book. History means what happened, and it's a record of what happened, not what might happen or what possibly could happen. It would be a futuristic book, like you were talking about earlier. So we're speaking here about the immutability of the necessary. We're tying in the necessary to immutability. Necessary cannot change in a certain way. Necessary cannot change. Is the historical the same immutability because history cannot change once it happens? We have to remember that it did once come into existence, which nullifies its necessity. So now, is that okay? Did I explain that?
Yeah, total sense. Makes total sense.
Okay. So the immutability of the necessary. So we're talking about that imagery in the mirror. This means that we reflect upon ourselves every moment and notice that we change each moment. Necessity does not see a difference as it relates itself to itself. History does. Okay, the distinction. History can look at itself in the mirror and see itself changing as time passes on. The necessity does not. It remains necessary. It cannot alter its essence, okay, or perhaps alter its essence. I'm not sure if he made the point, its essence or its existence. I'm not sure that we can put necessity in either place right now. I'm not sure that we can say the necessity exists in the essence or it exists in one. For right now, he's got me confused. He's got me at the point that I don't know where to put necessity. How about you?
You know, I don't know. I mean, I'm still, even throughout all of this, the thing that is still very clear to me is what necessity is and what is not necessary. All the other stuff about possibility and actuality and essence and existence and stuff like that. I wonder if it's just to sort of like confound us to set up the clarity of the necessity thing. Cause I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah. But if we boil down or filter down what you just said there by being necessary, do you see how we have a difficult time saying necessary is possible? Because it can't be possible. It has to be existing if it's necessary. Right. But if we say, okay, then it's existent, then we have to say that it's no longer possible. So we've destroyed it one way or the other. We've kind of destroyed that it's not necessary. So it has to always be kind of both. If anything, it always has to be both, yet it can't be both. That's the paradox. So he's setting us up with this different paradox here. I guess that's what I'm kind of just seeing right now. Anyway, would you say that's a fair thing, that we're in a paradox? We don't know what to do with the necessary, with God, sort of.
Yeah, I think the thing that concerns me is earlier in our conversation, we talked about what a synthesis of possible and actual would look like, and we talked about square circles.
Yeah.
And to me, I don't know. I don't think about square circles being a necessary thing, but of course, I don't think about Platonic forms either. And the only necessary thing I think about is God. If square circles are the synthesis of possible and actual, and that's what necessary is, then we have all these necessary things. We have all sorts of necessary things.
Yeah.
And I think that becomes problematic to me, because that would seem to do violence to the superiority of God as being the only necessary thing.
Yeah, I think hopefully I wasn't using it as a comparison to God. I was trying to use it something else, but it might have been an inferior example. But I think what he's setting up so far is that, do we really have anything that we can call necessary yet? In Kierkegaard's way of thinking, he's laying it out for us. What is the only necessary thing? God.
Yeah. God. You know what I would say is that if it is in fact the case, and I'm not going to claim here that I completely understand this metaphysical mumbo jumbo about possibility and actuality and stuff like that. And I don't mean to be dismissive about it. if it is in fact the case that possibility plus actuality does equal necessity, and we think we have other candidates for something that is necessary, i.e. a square circle, I would make the contention that it only appears to us to be necessary, that we may lack the cognitive apparatuses to distinguish what is truly necessary from what is only apparently necessary.
Yeah.
Because to me, there can only be one necessary thing.
Yeah.
And that's the cause of all, all of the universe. That would have to be God. And I think that's what Kierkegaard's saying too.
Yeah, I think that's where we're at here. So yeah, I don't think there's anything else that so far that Climacus can say is necessary. At this point, I think we're down to one thing, and that's God right now.
Can you think of anything else? I mean, I know the square circle thing is something you kind of just pulled out of your back pocket. Can you think of any other candidates for something that might be necessary that can be?
No, I think I think if we could come up with another example, it would negate the uniqueness of God as the example. That's why I was having trouble. I couldn't come up with an example, so I kind of fished around. But I don't think that there is another example as what could be necessary. But I think
you talk about soul, right? People talk about immortality of the soul, but presumably soul is generated in some way. They have some change built into it. So I don't know if they would be necessary. I don't know. Maybe you could think about the numbers. But
you're starting to break up quite a bit there. I'm not sure if it's going to be audible for the audience.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure why. So I didn't quite hear your question, but I think we were talking about trying to synthesize the essence with actuality. And what Kierkegaard is saying, you can't synthesize the two because you would destroy one in order to create the other. So that's, I think, what I was trying to speak about when I did the square circle. May not be a good example. I'd have to think about, is there something else that we can say? We take the essence of something and to try to synthesize it with something else and wind up with a third product. I don't know. I'd have to kind of go over what he's saying again here. I'm trying to think, was he trying to talk about a synthesis between essence and essence to come up with a third essence, or essence? I thought it was essence and actuality and come up with something else is what I thought it was.
Right.
Okay, and what he's saying is that you can't do that because you nullify one or the other. It's got to be either in essence or essence or in actuality for it to come about. You're sounding clear again now. Anyway,
yeah, I was just considering some other candidates for things that might be necessary, whether it be immortal soul or numbers or something like that. But I mean, immortal souls are obviously something that are generated, so they experience some kind of change and don't exist from eternity. So they wouldn't be proper candidates for something that would be necessary. And some people talk about math being eternal.
Yeah.
But Augustine takes this up on Free Choice of the Will. He speaks about math as just merely the wisdom that orders all of creation. So that ultimately comes from God as well. And, there's a lot of talk out there from people who don't even think about these things in terms of theological levels, that math is just a useful fiction that we create in order to get about in our world and send men to the moon and create satellites and stuff like that, that it doesn't really exist. It's not built into eternity. But that's a conversation for another day.
Well, I'll take a little homework with me here. I'm going to look into that again a little bit more and see if I can come up with either a better example or to clarify what he's actually saying there for my own benefit, if not for everybody else's, just to make sure that I'm on track here. I don't want to go in the wrong direction and take other people with me. So now the final little segment. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, what were you going to say? I mean, this final section's the apprehension of the past. I was thinking.
Oh, I didn't do the future. I didn't do the little future part here yet, where he talks about the future.
Oh, go for it. Go for it. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
it's just a little segment here. The future has not yet happened. The past did not become necessary because it came into existence. So we know the past isn't necessary because it came into existence. The fact it came into existence proves it wasn't necessary. If the past were necessary, the future would be necessary also. Why? Because eventually it becomes history.
Right.
So the future has the same properties as the past. Eventually, we just have to wait a little while. The past comes into existence as it changes from the possible to the actual through freedom. Here's where he really uses the word freedom here. Maybe we can glean something from it here. Freedom here is the freedom from the necessity. So when he says here, the past comes into existence as it changes from the possible to the actual through freedom. That's kind of where I derive my definition, that he's talking about things that can change, that they're free to change or transform in their existence. But the necessary does not have that same kind of freedom to change.
Yeah, but it's got other kinds of freedom.
Yeah, I think he's using it just specifically here for this sense here. And
I would say, just to get at what I'm hinting at here, Bob, we talked about in other sections how the individual in the process of attaining faith moves out of sin. And presumably, since the necessary is in a relationship with itself, it is entirely free of sin. So it may be free of the ability to change, but the most important freedom, it has in full measure.
Mm-hmm. He's talking about freedom here, but not necessarily in a positive sense either. When he's comparing it to God, of course, the freedom here, I think he's setting out a different goal for his meaning of the word. It has freedom to change, whereas necessity does not have freedom to change. Freedom for necessity would then become an illusion. So if the necessary could change, then it would become an illusion. And this is what do we call that again? The unchangeability of God.
Mm-hmm.
We kind of he's pushing us right up against that wall. Can we use the term freedom for a God who cannot change? Who maybe we might think of it, who's by his own will. He lives out his own will. It's not in the same sense of freedom that God is free to do evil. He can't do evil. So in a sense, God is limited. If we want to look at it in that term, God is limited in terms that, like you said, he can't sin.
Right.
It's kind of a limitation on total freedom, that we might say freedom to change. He can only he can only be God, which is of course plenty.
The only thing that really drives me mad about this immutability of God's necessity is that it seems to, so much of what Kierkegaard's work is not about creating this sort of icy, immutable, distant God that just kind of is, I don't know, like a monument or something like that.
Yeah.
But is very active
there yet, though, right?
Right.
You're absolutely right. That's the kind of situation he's building, is this Stonehenge kind of God that's immutable. He can't change. He's stuck with who he is in the eternal. But I think this is part of the illusion he's creating for us, that he's going to help us out a little later on.
Mm-hmm.
But we know, you and I know, that's not how he sees God.
No, he's not a deist. He's not, or this isn't some sort of demiurge that went off and forgot about us or something like that.
But maybe this is the Climacus showing here.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so we've got to keep that in mind here. This may not be Kierkegaard's thinking and purely his thoughts, but it's maybe what's going through Climacus's mind of building this absolute God out of philosophy somehow.
Yeah.
So, okay, that's where I leave you here now.
Well, it's I think we've been going for like an hour and a half or an hour and 15, hour and 20 minutes. I think this is probably a good chunk. I think maybe we should probably just start with section 4, the apprehension of the past, next time we get together.
Yeah.
Is that okay with you? Because
absolutely.
I've got some other commitments to attend to.
Yeah.
I know it's going a little bit slower than we anticipated, but I don't think anyone cares. I think if they've gone this far with us, I think they're fine with it.
I think I need an interlude.
Yes,
but
definitely.
Not the kind of interlude Kierkegaard gave us. I need another kind.
Yeah. Well, you've been the real workhorse here the past couple of weeks. We'll start off with me next time, and
okay.
Hopefully I can approximate the heavy lifting that you've been doing.
Okay, that's fair.
So I'll get this uploaded. We'll end the communication here, and we'll get this uploaded to the Noetic app. And I want to thank Bob again for leading our discussion.
Oh, thank you.
He had some very difficult material to sift through today. Thank you for following us along on this journey, and we'll be back soon.
Okay, bye-bye.